Good morning, everybody. Thank you all so much for being here today. My name is Zoe, and I will be presenting my thesis, Bold, Brave, and Essential, Investigating the Intersections of DEAI and Educational Programming at the Baltimore Museum of Art. So DEAI refers to diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion, which is an inherently complex topic. And it was really impossible for me to cover all of my research here with you this morning, so I've been very intentional about the structure of my presentation today. So I'm going to begin with an overview of logistics, which is introducing you all to the Baltimore Museum of Art, why I chose it as a case study, and my central research questions. I'm then going to pull key examples from my thesis, including my literature review, my findings from historical inquiry and data collection that illustrate the broader narrative and results of my thesis. So to begin, I'll introduce the Baltimore Museum of Art. The Baltimore Museum of Art is located in north central Baltimore, Maryland, directly adjacent to the Johns Hopkins University campus. It was founded in 1914 and is known famously for its expansive cone collection, which includes over 600 artworks by Henry Matisse. And the Baltimore Museum of Art presented itself as a compelling case study to me after I attended a keynote address by director Christopher Bedford in the spring of 2021. While I'll do my best to stay out of the weeds of this study's origin story, it is important to set the scene. So museums found themselves in the spotlight during 2020 and 2021 as they attempted to navigate the really compounding effects of the COVID-19 pandemic and social justice movements like Black Lives Matter. And Bedford's address was a public response to the intense scrutiny that the museum faced after they attempted to deaccession 3 artworks in October of 2020. The artworks were by artists Bryce Martin, Clifford Still, and Andy Warhol, all notably white male artists. And for those who may not be familiar, deaccessioning is a process of selling items from a museum's collection. It's a highly regulated process in museums, but this deaccessioning corresponded to amended regulations due to the financial strain of museums in 2020 and 2021 in the COVID-19 pandemic. But more importantly, the deaccessioning was the first active step in the BMA's new financial plan entitled Endowment for the Future. So funds from the sale of the deaccessioning would lay the groundwork for the museum to expand and fund its equity and diversity initiatives. And as I hope we all remember, and I'm sure we all remember, 2020 saw social justice uprisings and calls for a dismantling of privileged systems of power, which include museums with direct origins to colonialism and historically exclusionary practices. So in Bedford's speech, he summarizes this as, quote, calls for radical thinking and change across the arts and culture sector. And so the Endowment for the Future was created and the sale of the artworks proposed. However, due to controversy, which essentially questioned whether or not the BMA was breaking the rules of deaccessioning regulation through their proposed application of the funds, it was ultimately stopped by the American Alliance of Museums, outcry and protest by other museum professionals, and even the threat of an official investigation into their motivations by the Maryland Attorney General. And so what I thought that I saw, hypothesized that I saw at this keynote address, was a museum that was attempting to respond to their community and reform their practices by integrating diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion holistically within their museum, but was running into significant roadblocks by the field. And so while the BMA was in and of itself interesting to me, it was imperative that I ground my research in art education. With my personal motivations for researching art education as a mechanism for activating DEAI within museum spaces, I ultimately created the following research questions. So my central research question reads, what challenges and opportunities did the Baltimore Museum of Art encounter when they attempted to build and implement relevant DEAI educational programming in 2020 and 2021? How might this have affected the BMA's ability to connect to their audience through DEAI-oriented programs and resources? And finally, in what way did the challenges and opportunities faced by the BMA during 2020 and 2021 affect their educational programming, and as a result of this, their mission to sustain public relevancy, accessibility, and trust? And I structured my research within the descriptive case study methodology, and due to the nature of thesis research, limited my findings to the year 2020 and 2021. This would allow for a focused investigation into the events of one institution during a tumultuous period of time for museums, and the time boundary would also guarantee that I was able to finish my thesis on time. Okay, so dipping into my literature review and my theoretical framework, I applied the foundational lens of critical theory and, importantly, critical pedagogy. And this not only helped to situate my findings within a cultural institution like a museum, but this framework provided a binding connection between the museum, DEAI, and art education. Because within museums, art museum educators are often the primary touch point between the institution and their audience through public programming and educational resources. And I found two texts that were incredible resources at framing critical theory and critical pedagogy, specifically within museums and art museum education. So Julia Tapia explains that critical theory involves the recognition that institutions are not isolated entities that are immune from external influences. And this involves an understanding of the power structures within an institution and how those power structures function in and also reflect the outer world. Applying critical theory to museums specifically, we're able to understand the structure of powers within museums, to consider whose knowledge, whose history, and whose narratives have been historically privileged within them, as well as who has priority access to museums' information. Art museum educators are then given the unique opportunity to invite diverse narratives and shift power structures by giving diverse learners agency within the museum. And authors Cohen and Elamine take these considerations and fuse them with critical pedagogy, which provides specific instruction for the ways that art museum educators can embed critical theory into their practice. This happens through critical discussions of representation and equity in museums, intentional teaching practices that prioritize the histories of marginalized communities, and most importantly, by returning power to learners to contribute their lived experiences as a means of crafting and creating meaningful and equitable exchanges within the museum. At the root of critical theory and critical pedagogy within museums is the opportunity for museums educators to heal harmful, entrenched systems of inequity in cultural arts institutions. Through real connections to their communities, museums and their educators can transform these systems. And so DEAI initiatives are then positioned as a tangible means of offering that healing. And so after the deaccessioning event, the BMA continued to be decisively public about their continued efforts to integrate DEAI throughout the museum. And in fact, the museum's mission and vision page hosts the following message. Bold, brave, and essential, it is the unwavering vision of the Baltimore Museum of Art to be the most relevantly, publicly engaged museum in the United States and a dynamic model for all others. And relevancy here is an important term because relevancy means not only to the current art and cultural needs of a contemporary audience, but meaningful and relatable to their Baltimorean audience. And I wanted to understand who that community was, so the history and the demographics of Baltimore City, and why this mission for relevancy within the BMA was so integral. So as part of my data collection, I conducted a historical inquiry into both Baltimore City and the Baltimore Museum of Art. What I'm going to highlight now is information about Baltimore City that makes the mission for relevancy and public engagement expressly clear. So current statistics show us that Baltimore's population is over 60% Black. And within Baltimore today, there are still stark equity and accessibility disparities that largely correlate with particular geographic locations. And this is a direct result of events that took place over 100 years prior. Because Baltimore City was actually the birthplace of residential segregation in the United States. So it was schools that were segregated first in 1872, but for obvious reasons, both Black and white families needed to live where their children were allowed to go to school. And while there were some homogenous communities that existed in Baltimore at the time, it was still legal for Black and white residents to live in any ward of the city. When school segregation became law, it put an incredible strain on Baltimore and left Black Baltimoreans vulnerable to brutal and violent confrontation as they fought for housing and to educate their children. As a result of confusion from school segregation, Baltimore ultimately crafted the first Jim Crow residential segregation ordinances in 1910, and this lawfully segregated distinct areas of Baltimore City by white or black majority and made the existence of any mixed neighborhoods illegal. And while residential segregation was eventually outlawed in 1917, the damage left behind from the ordinances continues to haunt Baltimore. So author Lawrence T. Brown has created a host of research based on these lingering inequities. Using a racial dot map that you can see here, which correlates a single colored dot to an individual based on ethnicity, he has found that Baltimore has what he calls a black butterfly. So as you can see, hopefully on the screen here, is Baltimore's white population, which is noted in blue. And it's established from north to south in central Baltimore, reaching towards the harbor. And this is what's known as Baltimore's white L. And stretching out from the white L in each direction, here is Baltimore's black population noted in green butterfly wings that stretch in each direction. And as Brown describes, that basic community services like Zipcar or bike share programs are almost exclusively available within the white L. This leaves Black Baltimoreans still struggling for equitable means of inhabiting their city, with over-policing, health disparities, and underserved families, and arguably more prevalent within the black butterfly. And for my own research, again, as it was imperative that I understand how the BMA existed spatially within its city, I located the museum on the racial dot map. And what I found is that it is effectively located in the heart of the white L. And to me, this added nuance and clarity to the museum's repeated calls for DEAI within the museum to ensure that their true and their diverse community can see representation and find meaningful connection within their institution. Recalling what we now know of critical pedagogy, I again posit that the BMA was using the intersections of DEAI and art education as a means to heal the inequitable systems and histories of its city. And with this understanding, it was time to look for evidence and record findings specifically within the BMA. So in my thesis, I provide a comprehensive description of my additional methods of data collection and findings, which includes an analysis of their online education resources, as well as conducting a single-day site visit to the Baltimore Museum of Art in March of 2022. What I'm going to highlight now is, to me, the most telling and the most concise synthesis of the Baltimore Museum of Art's DEAI initiatives and art education programming, demonstrating a particular opportunity during the time frame of my research. So in September of 2021, the BMA announced that it wanted to reimagine itself, quote, from scratch. And this project was titled the Mellon Initiative and was made possible by a substantial donation from the Mellon Foundation. It was the BMA's most comprehensive DEAI undertaking to date. And the project's goal was to prioritize reevaluating, quote, the museum's exhibitions, acquisitions, public programming, staff and board, and other operations through the lens of equity and diversity. And while the Mellon Initiative unquestionably reiterates the BMA's institution-wide DEAI mission, this initiative presented one key difference, because the entirety of the project was directly bound to the BMA's education department. The partnership would be led by two staff members, Gaiman Quixote, the BMA's Chief Education Officer, who is the top image there, and museum educator Keandra Pryor. And Keandra Pryor is the BMA's current Mellon Fellow, and in this position was also appointed project manager for the Mellon Initiative. So she and Quixote would work in tandem to engage directly with the community to understand the successes and the challenges of the museum in serving its audience. And this is noteworthy twofold, because first, the BMA has placed two BIPOC female-identified staff members in senior positions, when only 4 years earlier, according to Director Christopher Bedford in 2017, there had never been BIPOC staff in senior leadership. And second, the project management decision reads as a direct recognition of the role the BMA's education department has, is, and will play in integrating DEAI successful within the museum in its entirety. And while the Mellon Initiative is a market shift for the museum as a whole, it reiterates the symbiotic relationship between DEAI and museum education that was the driving force for my research. And while findings such as the Mellon Initiative demonstrate true evidence of the productive intersections of DEAI and art education within the BMA, it is important to note that this work and these elements of progress are still very much developing. Throughout my research, I encountered limitations, both expected, like the COVID-19 pandemic, and unexpected in nature. Because while the BMA has been unfailingly public-facing about their endeavors, my personal attempts to engage directly and productively with the museum's educators was ultimately unsuccessful and undoubtedly influenced the outcome of my study. So over the past year, both myself and eventually my thesis committee attempted to contact the BMA's education department. Holding interviews with the BMA's educators seemed, not wrongly, like the most straightforward path to answering my research questions. But phone calls and emails, though at some stages seemed promising, were left unanswered, and I faced what felt like a very intentionally closed door. And during this period of time, I struggled to come to terms with the loss of what could have been valuable information. But eventually, I came to appreciate the limitation, because it raised a host of new questions for me. And as I reflect in the closing of my thesis, I believe I discovered an institution that is fiercely protective of the vulnerable, important, and necessary DEAI work that they are attempting to accomplish. The deaccessioning event left deep wounds, both within the BMA and the Baltimore community itself. I believe that my findings and also my limitations show that the museum is perhaps still playing defense, public in its endeavors, but still protective of its mission and the people working to make it possible. And this leads into the final section of my presentation, implications to the fields. So with an understanding of both the challenges and successes that the BMA faced in the pursuit of transformative change, we can better understand the ways that art education may act as a positive mechanism to further equity, diversity, accessibility, and inclusion work in the future. Art museum educators are still, by and large, the primary contact between an institution and its community through programming and resources. And by recognizing their pedagogical practices as a natural means of implementing DEAI into museums, art museum educators may be further empowered to carve space for equitable exchanges, bringing in voices that are so often left in the margins of power. And this is necessary for museums to remain relevant institutions to their communities, and this study benefits the field through awareness of one museum's mission and its successes and in its struggles during a period of time when museums have been called to turn inward and reflect on their harmful histories. And as far as the BMA, their journey is far from over. So as of February of 2022, just a few months ago, Christopher Bedford has left the museum to take the helm as director at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. SF MoMA's previous director resigned a year earlier during an unstable period with rampant allegations of a racist and inequitable work environment. And Bedford's commitment to integrating DEAI were largely recognized as the reasons for his appointment. So as SF MoMA seems to embark on its own equitable reimagining, the BMA continues on. And many, including Bedford himself, have remarked that for the BMA to solidify its DEAI missions, it should hire its first Black director. And while this director seat remains open for now, the BMA has yet to stay out of the spotlight. And as of this month, the BMA has opened their latest exhibition entitled Guarding the Art, where their diverse security officers have become a team of curators. And this is an example of shifting the power structures and traditional hierarchies of the museum staff. And the security officers have created a show that exemplifies their personal connection to the artworks and to their community. As I continue my own work within the intersections of art museum education and DEAI, these changes that are hard-won leave me feeling hopeful for the fields. The work of truly integrating diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion within art education in our museums takes strength and even a little bit of bravery. May we continue to find support in one another as we push onward in these efforts. Thank you.